She had the vision board taped above her desk, a collage of clipped images and handwriting that promised a different life. She had spent Sunday afternoons placing gold stars beside bowls, rearranging the layout until it felt just so. She'd whispered affirmations into the mirror, played manifestation playlists while she made tea, smudged sage like a ritual of permission. At night, she journaled into the small hours, listing the things she wanted as if ink could summon them. And every morning, she woke with the same small ache behind her ribs, the quiet knot of "not yet" sitting like an unwanted roommate. Why isn't it working? That ache is the signal. It tells you something important. Nothing changes while you're waiting. Not because you aren't trying hard enough, but because the posture from which you are trying is the very thing that keeps the pattern in place. You can stitch together every technique, the vision boards, the rituals, the repeated mantras, and still find yourself living the same story, because practices done from hunger reinforce hunger. The central paradox is this: seeking, in the way we usually do it, often perpetuates lack. Let that land for a moment. You are not being accused. You are being seen. We've all been trained to believe that more doing equals more results. The culture feeds that belief. Hustle, try harder, optimize. But there are layers beneath the doing, a subterranean current of identity and nervous system habit that determine what those actions actually signal to the world. You can enact every technique on the checklist and still show up energetically as a person who is lacking, anxious, and on edge. The world reads that before it reads your words. To understand why, we'll look at two complementary frames. One borrows language from modern physics as a metaphorical lens, not to prove metaphysical claims, but to invite a fresh way of seeing how attention shapes experience. The other draws on what neuroscience tells us about how the brain and body hold patterns of scarcity. Together, they show how observation and embodiment interact. What you're looking from matters more than what you're looking at. Think of the quantum idea like this. At the smallest scales, particles don't sit neatly in one place like marbles on a table. Instead, they behave like clouds of possibility, probabilities spread across space. When a measurement is made, when an observation occurs, that cloud's many possibilities collapse into a particular outcome. Some physicists and thinkers, names that appear in the culture around this idea, like Werner Heisenberg and John Wheeler, have described observation as a kind of creative act, a collapse that selects one line out of many possible lines. Popular interpretations have translated that into spiritual language. Attention collapses possibility into form. I want to be clear about how I'm using that language.
The science itself is subtle and complex, and does not offer a neat scientific proof that thought directly creates physical reality in the way some popular teachers assert. Instead, the metaphor is helpful. Attention functions like a camera lens. Where your lens focuses, potentialities sharpen into one path. The metaphor asks, what if your way of observing was choosing similar outcomes again and again? If your inner posture is one of wanting, yearning, or scarcity, then your attention may consistently select experiences that match that frequency. That's the core idea we're playing with, not a technical claim about subatomic causation, but a practical picture of how consistent attention patterns tune your experience. Now layer on the neuroscience. Your brain evolved to keep you alive. It's brilliant at scanning for threats and ensuring survival, because survival was the problem our ancestors faced daily. Scarcity is a survival story. When resources were unpredictable, our nervous systems adapted to prioritize vigilance. This wiring served you in environments where danger had to be spotted immediately. But the same wiring also gives rise to habit loops that can be unhelpful in modern life. Once your brain learns that anxiety yields attention, it will habitually reproduce that state because it has been coded as what keeps me alive. When you perform manifestation rituals from a place of hunger, your body registers the energy around those practices. Your breath might be shallow, your shoulders tense, your heart rate elevated. You speak in a tone that carries urgency. Those bodily signals are louder to the nervous system than the content of your dream list. The brain's reward structures and prediction systems then match new inputs to what they already know. In short, state dictates signal. If you show up as a person who is not quite safe or whole, your nervous system, with great fidelity, will produce evidence consistent with that identity. This is where coherence comes in. Coherence is a term used both in physics and in physiology. In physics, it refers to waves aligning. In physiology, it refers to states when heart rate variability, breath, and neuropatterns settle into a harmonious rhythm. Coherence feels like an open palm. Incoherence, the scattered, clutching energy of lack, feels like a clenched fist. The metaphor is simple but telling. An open palm invites, a clenched fist repels. The posture you habitually embody sends a kind of field to the world. That field is not mystical in the sense of unfalsifiable magic. It's a pattern of micro-communications, your tone, your posture, your micro-expressions, the way you move through spaces that others pick up on and that your own nervous system perpetuates. So why does nothing change while you're waiting? Because waiting often implies a forward-looking tension. You are holding the future in front of you with desire and simultaneously holding a story of not having. The energy is split.
The attention is reaching. The nervous system, trained to do urgent scanning, interprets this as scarcity by default. Practice after practice, ritual after ritual, becomes evidence that you are still the person who doesn't have it yet. The paradox is that the striving itself is an input that confirms the story you are trying to change. This is not a call to passive resignation. The alternative I'm pointing to is not passivity, it's a reorientation. Instead of continuing to perform from lack, you can shift into a stance I call the observer. The observer is not someone who checks out or disengages. The observer is present, clear, and embodied. The observer watches without needing the sight to prove worth. The observer is an identity from which actions flow without the liveliness of grasping. It is a steady base, like the quiet of a deep lake beneath surface ripples. When you operate from that place, your practices have a different energetics. They signal sufficiency rather than hunger. Imagine two people planting the same seed. One plants it with clenched hands, mind racing, waiting desperately for the sprout to prove worth. The other plants it with an open palm, knowing the soil, tending calmly, trusting in the process without being consumed by outcomes. The difference is not the seed, but the soil, the inner climate in which the seed is placed. The observer mindset cultivates soil that supports growth precisely because it does not drain the energy needed for flourishing into a constant state of anxious monitoring. To put it another way, seeking is a performance that asks the world for validation. Observing is a posture of sufficiency that allows the world to respond. Seeking is future anchored. Observing is present anchored. Seeking is identity based on lack. Observing is identity based on wholeness. The language of identity is crucial here because identity is the operating system that runs your attention and actions. If your default identity is seeker, every tool you pick up becomes a means to fill a hole. If your default identity is observer, tools are used as expressions of alignment, not frantic patchwork. This shift is neither instant nor magical. It is a practice, but the practice is deceptively simple. It requires learning to notice the difference between doing from wanting and doing from being. That noticing itself begins to loosen the old loops. And there are practical ways to access the observer posture, ways that rely neither on complicated breathwork nor on grand rituals. One such method is a short embodiment practice that leads you into the steady center behind reactive patterns. It's compact, gentle, and safe for most people. It uses breath, attention placement, and a simple silent phrase to help reposition your nervous system from clutching to open receptivity. If you're comfortable, try this now. Sit in a chair with your feet grounded. Feel their contact with the floor.
Let your hands rest loosely in your lap, an open palm if that resonates. Allow the spine to be upright, but not rigid, a kind alertness. Take a slow, gentle inhalation through the nose, not forceful, simply complete. And exhale through the mouth with ease. Do that 2 more times. Notice how your shoulders often round forward when you are waiting, how the chest tightens, how the jaw tenses. See it with compassion. This is conditioning, not failure. Now bring your attention softly to the space behind your eyes. That sense of looking without moving the eyes, a kind of interior gaze. Don't strain, simply notice whatever appears in the field. You might notice images, thoughts, or sensations. Or you might notice a quiet space. Allow whatever is there to be, as if you were listening to a piece of music rather than trying to change the notes. In this listening, place on your mental lips the quiet sentence, I choose to observe from wholeness. Say it silently, not as a mantra to force results, but as a calibration. You are choosing to recognize yourself as the one who witnesses, whole already. Breathe again, gently, and let the phrase resonate across the body. Notice if anything tightens. Sometimes the mind resists the very idea of being whole, and breathe into that resistance. Notice any small shift. A softening behind a sternum, a loosening in the jaw, a lengthening of the spine. These are subtle, but they matter. Presence is built from small things. Stay with this for 30 to 90 seconds, no more pressure than that. When you're ready, open your eyes and simply observe what's different. You may notice nothing dramatic, and that's fine. Often the first effects are quiet, a slight slowing of breath, a changed tilt of the head, a sense that you can tolerate uncertainty without spiraling. If this lands for you, I invite you to notice, and if it truly lands, type this into the comments now. I choose to observe from wholeness. That small act creates a tiny field, a public marker that can remind you later, and it helps others see they're not alone in this work. Before we go further, it's important to keep a few honest guardrails in view. When I reference physicists such as Werner Heisenberg or John Wheeler, or cultural teachers like Neville Goddard, Abraham Hicks, Florence Scovel Shinn, and Joe Dispenza, I'm pointing to ideas that have influenced how many people talk about attention and reality. These names and their observations are part of a long conversation that mixes science, philosophy, and spiritual inquiry. But we should be humble about claims. Popular readings of quantum mechanics stretch the language of physics into metaphors for consciousness, and that's useful as a map, not as an incontrovertible proof. Likewise, neuroscience gives us insights into patterning and habit, but it doesn't single-handedly translate into guarantees about outcomes.
The point is practical, not dogmatic. When you change the posture from which you act, the signals you send, both to yourself and to others, change too. If you found the practice slightly shifting your internal weather, that's a meaningful start. If it felt awkward or forced, that's fine too. Our nervous systems often protest a new story at first. The work is to make small, consistent choices that favor the observer's field over the seeker's clutch. One choice is not enough. It's the repeated recalibration of attention and embodied posture that begins to create a new operating system. Imagine retraining a muscle. You wouldn't expect a transformation after one session, but after consistent, gentle practice, the muscle remembers differently. Let's return for a moment to the image of the quantum camera as a metaphor. Imagine yourself carrying a camera that, instead of capturing light, captures the energetic frame from which you move. If you point it from a place of lack, every scene you photograph will emphasize absence. If you point it from a place of wholeness, the frame opens to nuance, possibility, and different kinds of evidence. The camera doesn't create the world out of nothing, it selects what it sees. Attention works in the same way. It doesn't have to be mystical language to be true in practice. The one who is calmly attentive will notice opportunities the frantic seeker misses. That's not magic, it's pattern recognition deployed from a steadier platform. You may be wondering, if I stop trying so hard, will I become complacent? The answer is no, for two reasons. First, the observer is not passive. It acts, but from a different energy. Actions taken from wholeness are clearer, more aligned, and less scattered than actions taken from longing. Second, the observer is curious, not resigned. Curiosity opens you to feedback without turning every piece of feedback into a verdict on personal worth. That allows for adaptive change without the emotional drag of performance anxiety. There are practical consequences to this shift that are commonly reported. People often describe feeling calmer, having a clearer sense of choice, and experiencing small synchronistic moments that feel like the world answering in ways they hadn't before. Those experiences are not guaranteed. They are reported tendencies that emerge when someone consistently inhabits a more coherent field. The language of magnetism is useful here. Coherence tends to align similar patterns. You do not control outcomes. You change the conditions that make certain outcomes more likely to show up as intelligible and accessible. At the same time, we must keep compassionate skepticism to our own expectations. The moment we create a new rule, once I enter observer mode, everything will align immediately. We are back to results-based identity and its attendant anxieties.
The invitation is to practice being the observer, to test it experimentally, and to track what shifts over time. Keep a log if that helps. What did you do? What was your felt state? What changed? Small, methodical notes can help you see what's happening without operating from the wild swings of hope and disappointment. There is, too, a social dimension to this work. When you embody a steadier presence, you communicate differently with others. The way you hold yourself in conversation, how you listen without immediate reactivity, the allowance you give for silence. These things transmit a field that others pick up on. Coherence doesn't isolate you, it tunes you. People often report that their relationships feel less frantic and more reciprocal when they are less driven by need. Opportunities, collaborations, invitations, these are more likely to appear in environments where people feel a certain calm receptivity rather than frantic grasping. So far, we've mapped the problem, sketched the metaphor of the quantum camera, explained the neuroscience of scarcity, and offered a short practice to taste the observer state. The next step is to consider how identity actually shifts on a deeper level. How do you move from labeling yourself a seeker to living as an observer? That movement is where many people stall, because identity is not a thought to be changed, it's a felt, embodied orientation. It requires repetition, social support, and often small rituals that mark the new story. One helpful approach is to create micro-commitments that are identity consistent. Instead of setting a far-off goal that the seeker within you can weaponize into pressure, choose daily actions that align with the observer's posture. For example, you might decide to spend 5 minutes each morning in the practice we just did. Not because 5 minutes will change everything, but because 5 minutes repeated establishes a cue that the nervous system can learn from. Over time, these micro-commitments accumulate into the muscle memory of a different identity. Another practice is language recalibration. The seeker's language contains scarcity phrases: I need, I don't have, I must. The observer's language shifts subtly: I notice, I choose, I'm curious. Language is not the whole work, but it signals intention and shapes attention. When you notice yourself slipping into scarcity language, treat it like a data point. Observe it. That observation itself is an act of the observer. Community and modeling matter too. We are wired to mirror. If your social field is mostly frantic seekers, your nervous system will mirror that tone. It's not about judgment, it's about energetic contagion. Seek small pockets of coherence: a friend who practices presence, a teacher who models steadiness, a group that values being over performance. These environments help the new identity feel not only possible, but normal. There's a danger worth naming here: spiritual bypassing.
Sometimes the language of observe from wholeness becomes a way to avoid real work. The observer is not a mask you don to escape responsibility. True observation includes seeing pain, shadow, and practical obstacles. Observing from wholeness means you can look at difficulties without that look turning immediately into shame or frantic fixing. It gives you a steadier platform from which to act skillfully. As you begin to live from the observer, you will notice friction. Old friends, old contracts, and even old parts of yourself will test the borders of the new orientation. The seeker inside may try to negotiate, promising quick returns if you'll just try one more thing. Listen with compassion and steadiness. Offer the seeker a seat at the table, not as the driver, but as one voice among many. The practice is to hold both curiosity and discernment. Curiosity for what's possible, discernment for what aligns with the observer's field. This is a lot to take in, and it all traces back to the simple sentence that began us: nothing changes while you're waiting. Waiting, as we commonly experience it, is a stance that keeps you in a feedback loop of desire and evidence that you are wanting. The invitation is to experiment with a different posture, not to stop wanting, but to shift the place from which wanting is held. Wanting held by an open palm moves differently through the world than wanting held by a clenched fist. If you've been practicing with me, you might notice an inner distinction now, a small tonal shift, a tiny lessening of the ache. That's the doorway. The rest of the work is a process of stepping through it, not in one dramatic leap, but in many small acts of realignment. In the next section, we will explore how to sustain this identity shift over time, how to manage the social and emotional friction that arises, and how coherence shows up as lived magnetism. We'll also look closely at concrete strategies, micro-commitments, language, and social architecture that help the observer stick when the world whispers its old narratives. For now, carry this idea with you. Nothing changes while you're waiting, but everything shifts when you begin to observe from wholeness. The door is open. The choice is simple. Move forward then into practical scaffolding, how to make the observer stick when life pulls you back toward the old scripts. The work is less dramatic than you imagine. It looks like attention redistributed across ordinary moments. It's the tiny rituals that mark a new identity, not grand declarations. Below are ways to translate the insight into material habit, social architecture, and emotional curiosity so that the observer becomes your default home. First, anchor moments. Choose 2 or 3 predictable transitions in your day and turn them into checkpoints for the observer. These are not additional tasks on a to-do list. They are brief recalibrations.
Examples: the first sip of coffee, the moment you sit down at your desk, the pause before you open email, the doorstep before you leave the house. In each checkpoint, take no more than 30 seconds to orient. Feel your feet, soften the jaw, place attention behind the eyes for a breath or two, and silently offer the calibration phrase, "I choose to observe from wholeness." Over time, these micro-anchors create a web of signals your nervous system can use to remember steadiness. They work because they are reproducible and tied to existing routines. They don't demand extra hours, just brief reallocation of attention. Second, the debug cycle. When the old clutch returns, you overcommit, spiral into comparison, or compulsively recheck results. Treat that as data, not failure. The observer's response to relapse is different. Instead of self-reproach, ask 3 small questions. What happened? Where did my attention go? What's the smallest next step that honors this new posture? Keep these answers practical. Maybe the pattern you notice is that you scroll for affirmation after a difficult conversation. The smallest step might be closing the phone and taking a single breath, or text message a friend instead of seeking likes. Repetition of small corrective actions rewires habits faster than grand resolutions. The debug cycle preserves curiosity and momentum. Third, language rituals. Consciously reshape your inner and outer language to align with the observer. Swap scarcity verbs and qualifiers for observational phrasing. For instance, when you catch yourself thinking, "I don't have enough," shift to, "I notice tension around not having enough." When you hear yourself say, "I must prove this," try, "I'm choosing what action to take now." These are not incantations that magically fix things. They are linguistic nudges that change the wireframing of attention. Language is habit-forming, and used intentionally, it becomes a net that captures and redirects the seeker's impulses. Fourth, design your field. We are social animals. Who we spend time with, how we consume media, and what we rehearse in conversation all shape the nervous system. Take stock of where you notice contagion of frantic energy. You don't need to cut people off to protect your calm. Instead, add more exposure to coherence. Seek out one person or one group whose presence feels steady. That might be a friend who listens without jumping to fix, a coach who models grounded action, or a weekly meditative circle that practices simple presence. When the world's drumbeat is frantic, even small pockets of steadiness provide a scaffold for the new identity. Fifth, ritualize short reflection. Once a week, spend 5 minutes logging observations. What shifted, what persisted, what triggered the seeker. You're not measuring success metrics in the old sense. You're mapping patterns. Over time, you'll notice themes. Certain contexts trigger scarcity. Certain practices actually soothe the nervous system. Certain commitments create friction. These notes are like field reports, helping you iterate with humility. Sixth, integrate action with presence. The observer is not inactivity in disguise. It takes effective, aligned action. The difference is the energetic substrate from which action arises. When you act from the observer's place, decisions are clearer, priorities are less reactive, and follow-through is less scattered. Try a small experiment. Pick a project that matters to you. Instead of approaching it with the hammer of "I must prove I'm worthy," allocate a dedicated block of time and enter it with a brief centering. Settle, observe, then work in a focused way for that block. Notice whether the output and your experience of the output shifts. Often the work feels less frantic and produces cleaner results. To make this concrete, imagine Maya. For years, she chased promotion signals, better titles, testimonials, visible wins. She had rituals, courses, and a planner full of deadlines. The more she pushed, the more anxious she became. When she learned to practice observer anchors, a 30-second recalibration before every meeting, a weekly 5-minute reflection, and one friend who modeled grounded leadership, her internal climate changed. She began to make different choices. Fewer bids for attention, more deliberate offers of service. Opportunities followed, not because she learned a trick, but because her behavior and signals shifted. Other people found her easier to work with and her decisions clearer. This is an example, not a promise. Your experience may differ, but stories like this point to the plausibility of pattern shift. There will be social friction. Not everyone in your life will recognize or understand the change. Old patterns can be comfortable for those around you. Your steadiness may feel like distance to a friend used to reactive energy. When this happens, keep communication simple and compassionate. Explain that you are experimenting with presence and that you still care. Offer the seeker voice a seat at the table. Acknowledge that part of you is anxious about being seen as distant. Balance steadiness with responsiveness. Over time, people will adapt. Some will not, and that's information too. Another practical principle: time block curiosity, not outcomes.
Instead of scheduling a deadline around a hoped-for result, schedule opportunities for learning. For instance, rather than promising yourself that a course will change your life by a certain date, commit to 3 experiments with the observer posture during the course, short, measurable, and not outcome-dependent. Measure whether your felt state shifts, whether your decisions feel less reactive. This approach reduces the stakes of any one result and allows your nervous system to relax into the practice.
There's also the important work of tending to the body's baseline. Coherence is fostered when the body's regulatory systems have reliable inputs. Sleep, movement, hydration, and exposure to natural light are not glamorous spiritual practices, but they deeply affect how readily you can inhabit the observer. Consider these supports as infrastructure. Better infrastructure reduces noise. And when you're in a lower noise state, your attention has more room to choose how to respond. We should also name the temptation to instrumentalize the observer. You might think, if this works, I'll use it to get promotion, relationships, or wealth. That orientation recreates the old dynamic, using a state as a tool to fill a hole. The more sustainable start is to cultivate observer identity as intrinsic. You tune into it because it feels steadier and truer, not merely because it's a lever for external gain. External gains are possible. They are simply not guaranteed, nor the direct evidence we seek. The real metric is, do you feel more whole in the process of living? That felt sense is the compass. Let's add a practical buffer for heavy moments. The observer isn't a firewall against pain. It's a stance that can accompany deep difficulty. When grief, loss, or major stress arrives, the observer's initial task is not to negate feeling, but to permit it with steadiness. The practice is to pair feeling with curiosity. Notice the sensations, label them gently, and allow the body to register them without the imperative to fix immediately. If the load is clinical or overwhelming, treat the observer as complementary to professional support. Observing supports presence and reflective capacity. It is not a substitute for therapy or medical care when those are needed. Another useful technique is rhythm matching. When you notice your nervous system escalate, rather than trying to fight it head-on, match its rhythm for a breath and then slow. This is not about suppression. It's about compassionate regulation. For example, if your breath is quick after a difficult call, breathe with it for 1 cycle. Acknowledge it, then lengthen the next exhale by a few counts. The body tends to follow microrhythms. These micro-regulatory moves are accessible, private forms of reparative practice that restore the conditions for observation. Over months, an interesting phenomenology often emerges: the collapse of timeline pressure. People speak of timelines collapsing as synchronicities and opportunities appear more coherently. Remember to interpret this language carefully. It's useful as a descriptive metaphor for alignment. You may notice that decisions fall into place, that invitations appear at moments when your attention is calm enough to recognize them, or that relationships proceed in less frantic ways. These are not miraculous guarantees, but reasonable consequences of clearer signal, reduced noise, and patterned attention aligning with possibility.
You may also notice an increase in selective attention. You will begin to notice more quickly what is worth deep energy and what is not. That discernment is a side benefit of steadier attention. As a practical habit, when an opportunity arrives, practice a 2-step check. 1. Pause and notice your felt state. 2. If you feel constriction or clutching, breathe and recenter. Only then open into decision. This builds an ability to respond rather than react. Accountability helps, not in the sense of performance metrics that fuel anxiety, but in the sense of shared practice. Find one person to practice with, a friend, a partner, a small group, and exchange simple reports. Did you anchor today? Did you notice any clutching? Did you use the observer phrase? These reports can be short. They create a mirror that supports continuity. Community makes the new orientation normal. It reduces the isolation that often fuels clutching. There will be setbacks. Expect them. Each setback is a rehearsal for the observer. Observe the emotional narrative that accompanies relapse. What story do you tell yourself? How quickly do you move from noticing to shaming? Practice catching shame early and replacing it with the debug cycle's curiosity. The observer is a forgiving tutor. Over time, the frequency and intensity of setbacks tend to lessen. Equanimity increases. One more practical frame. Treat identity like climate engineering. You are not flipping a switch so much as gradually changing atmospheric chemistry. Climate shifts are slow. They require many small, consistent changes: planting trees, reducing pollutants, altering habits. Likewise, identity shifts require cumulative, relatively small adjustments across attention, language, and social field. Be patient. The observer grows by accretion. As we bring this to a close, let's return to the core image one last time. The open palm. That palm doesn't create a vacuum of desire. It simply changes the way desire is held. It lets wanting be an offering rather than a demand. It allows you to act from a steadier place. When you practice the observer, you are not abandoning goals. You are changing the posture from which you go after them. This change alters the ecosystem of your life in ways that often feel subtle and then later unmistakable. If you feel moved by this work, there is a resource in the pinned comment that may help you stabilize the practice, the short ebook titled Awaken Your Quantum Power. It offers a structured set of micro-commitments, tracking tools, and reflections to support the identity shift. If this message resonated, consider subscribing and sharing with someone who might value a steadier field. These are small acts that amplify a community practicing presence rather than performance. Return, if you choose, to the simple practice we opened with. Anchor it in your life. Track it. Invite curiosity to sit with you, even when the seeker bargains for certainty.
The practice is not to erase longing, but to change the hands that hold it. Remember the title as an invitation and a challenge. Nothing changes while you're waiting. If you want the world to respond differently, begin by changing the way you look at it, the camera of attention held from wholeness. Start there, and let the rest follow in time.